Have you ever been told that your labs are normal, but you feel anything but normal? Maybe you've been to a functional medicine practitioner and you've been told that your labs have been optimized with medication, but you feel anything but optimal. In today's Thyroid Shorts podcast, we're going to discuss why your thyroid labs may not tell the full story. They may tell somebody a story, but they may not really tell the full story. And I'm hoping that in this short episode, you'll start to understand why the labs may not tell the full story of what's going on with your thyroid physiology and your health in general. So let's get started. Why? What is the biggest here? There's some fundamental challenges with thyroid panels, and especially from a medical perspective. If you go see your GP, if you go see your endocrinologist, one of the biggest challenges is that what gets measured gets managed. And in traditional medicine, they're typically only looking at one test, TSH, and maybe a second test, free T4. A lot of physicians will just run a TSH, and some will run a TSH with a reflex to free T4, which means that if TSH is abnormal, too high, too low, a free T4 test will be done automatically. Now, let's take both of these values, the TSH and the free T4, we'll take them separately. And medical physicians have been trained that the TSH is the screening test, and that TSH, if it's out of the lab reference range, you either have a hypothyroid condition or a hyperthyroid condition. And so that is the screening test. And so if TSH is within a normal range, there's nothing wrong with your thyroid physiology and you don't need any thyroid medication. And unfortunately, that's just not true. I've talked about this multiple times on the big podcasts. I talk about it in some of my writings, and I talk about it in the book. There are multiple factors that could influence a TSH to be within range and abnormal for the patient, or to be abnormal and still be appropriate. Okay. So there's lots of things that can influence TSH. And especially when it comes to you've been told you're normal, but you don't feel normal. One of the biggest influences that it impacts the TSH level, especially early on in a thyroid condition, is inflammation, which is the biggest challenge that we have, is chronic low-grade inflammation. That inflammation can suppress TSH temporarily, and it can also reduce the conversion of T4 to T3, causing hypothyroid signs and symptoms in the tissues. So the number one issue for medical clinicians is that they just run a limited panel. And why do they do that? Because that's how they've been trained. And what gets measured gets managed. If you only measure those two values, then you only have to manage those two values. So TSH, despite what your doctor may think, is not a fantastic indicator of what's going on throughout the body, especially if somebody's in a stressed or adaptive state we call allostasis. If you're in homeostasis, maybe it does represent the thyroid status in the body. But if you're not in homeostatic state and you're in a more allostatic adaptive state, it's probably going to be a problem. It's probably not going to represent how you feel. So let's talk about why using only free T4 to represent the thyroid hormone production that's in the bloodstream may be a problem. The thyroid gland makes primarily T4, and we can measure T4 in two different forms: total T4 and free T4. We used to measure total T4, how much is bound to the transport proteins, and then how much was getting free to get into the cells. At some point, somebody said, we don't really care about the total because it's only the free part that can get into the cells. So let's just measure that. The challenge is it doesn't tell us, again, the full story, how much hormone is actually being made, or how much T4 is in the bloodstream. Only 1% is free. So is it okay to just care about the 1%? Well, there's a lot of things that can influence the free value. Okay. And so you could have plenty of T4 in the system and still have a low free T4. And so does more T4 in that situation? Is that what the body really needs? Maybe not. And so there are other factors that could cause free T3 to be high despite maybe low levels of total T4. So it's, again, looking at a small picture. But even bigger than that, while it's not telling us how much is actually being made or how much is actually being taken in the bloodstream, it also doesn't tell us what's actually happening inside the cells. Now, you have to remember that T4, free T4, is not the active hormone. It has to get into the cells, converted to T3 to have its primary effect. Now, there are some functions of T4, but to keep it simple, what really drives cell physiology and cell metabolism inside the cell is the amount of T3 binding to receptors inside the cell. And the amount of T4 doesn't tell us that. Some physicians believe if I just jack up T4, the higher the T4, it must mean the more T3 that's in the tissues. And that's not necessarily the case. As there's too much T4 in the bloodstream, it actually reduces the cellular conversion of T4 to T3. Now, at some point, if you put somebody into a true hyperthyroid state with medication, yes, there's going to be more T3 in circulation. And yes, there may be more T3 in the cells, but that's also an issue and a problem. We don't want somebody in a chronic hyperthyroid state just to attain some symptom improvement. Okay. So both of these values, not just to run these only, is not an optimal way to look at your physiology. So if you only looked at TSH or only looked at TSH and free T4, it may not tell us how much T3 is inside the cells and tissues. And if you have normal TSH, normal T4, normal free T4, but low total T3 and low free T3, you may have chronic hypothyroid signs and symptoms despite those two values being normal. All right. So another thing we have to consider in why your labs may not tell the story. And that is that labs are too often read for an H or an L instead of interpreted. So doctors in both allopathic and functional medicine many times think that all I need to do to restore thyroid physiology and to restore health is to give this person enough medication, whether it's T4, T3, T4, and T3, to manipulate the value they care about back into a reference range or an optimal range, as many would say. And sometimes that does restore value. If you have a gland that can't function and work anymore, then you need to give an appropriate level of thyroid medication that's going to replace what a thyroid gland should have done. But a thyroid gland makes maybe 100 micrograms of T4, maybe 5 to 10 micrograms of T3. So if you need more than that, then there's other issues going on. Maybe there's a gut issue. Maybe there's a malabsorption issue. If you don't convert T4 to T3 very well, you don't need more than 10 micrograms of T3 unless you have a gut issue or malabsorption issue. But maybe you really have an inflammatory condition that's down-regulating the metabolism. So doctors often believe that if there's no H or L on your lab report, that everything's fine, right? In functional medicine, we might even say those silly medical doctors, they're looking at too broad of values. But if your value's within our optimal range, that's healthier, that's better. And that may be actually worse for you. So you can't just look for an H or L. You can't just assume a normal value is appropriate. So here's some of the considerations that I think we should all consider when we're interpreting somebody's labs. One, we want to run as full a thyroid panel as we can. Okay. And I rarely ever run a thyroid panel on its own. I typically run it with at least one tissue marker. And usually at the start of working with somebody, I'll run a comprehensive metabolic panel with it. And I'll get into that in a little bit. So 4 considerations when we look at a lab value. Is the lab value normal and appropriate? Meaning if you feel good and you function good and you have no signs and symptoms and the lab value is in the normal range, It's probably appropriate. So let's say you feel good, you function good, your weight's good, your energy's good, your TSH is in the 1 to 2 range. It's normal. Is it appropriate? Probably. A lab value could be normal and inappropriate. Let's say you come into my office and you have hypothyroid signs and symptoms, constipated, low libido, fatigue, thinning eyebrows, thinning hair. You got all the classic signs of hypothyroidism. And I look at your TSH and it's normal, maybe even optimal. It's true, it's normal, it's optimal, but it's not appropriate for you. And that's where we have to interpret, because then what I might say is, okay, wait a minute. The good part is, I mean, let me say it this way. The lab value is normal, but it's not appropriate for you. So now what I need to do is look at what might cause that TSH to be inappropriately normal when you have chronic hypothyroid signs and symptoms. I've got to look at a number of factors, inflammation markers. I'm going to look at the medications, the supplements, the things that you were taking leading up to the test. I got to look at the timing of the lab draw. So that's the second consideration. The third consideration is the lab value abnormal and appropriate? Okay, so TSH, lab high, you're upset, frustrated. Oh my gosh, I got a thyroid condition. Yeah, you do, but it's good because TSH is elevated. You have hypothyroid signs and symptoms. That's an appropriate lab value for somebody who has hypothyroid signs and symptoms. Now we can get busy trying to address it. And then the fourth consideration would be the lab value is abnormal and appropriate. And I'm sorry, abnormal and inappropriate. So what does this mean? So let's say you came into my office and you said, hey, I feel good. I function good. I feel awesome. Actually, I think I'm as healthy as I could possibly be. I want you to take my labs and show me how healthy I am. And we run your labs and we find out that your high sensitivity CRP is 50. Okay. When usually it should be less than like 1. The lab value is abnormal and it's inappropriate for the person sitting in front of me. So what do? We have to look at that and say, okay, maybe what we need to do is retest the lab to make sure the lab didn't make a mistake. And if it's still elevated, then we have to start looking at the patient and say, what kind of sinister thing is going on in this person that's causing this? We have to figure that out. So those are the 4 considerations that I take a look at initially when I look at it, any labs, but definitely when I'm looking at a thyroid panel. The other things that have to be considered is we have to interpret those labs with those thoughts in mind in conjunction with the rest of the labs, right? Labs tell a story. A thyroid panel tells a story, but it doesn't tell the full story unless we look at the tissue markers, unless we look at inflammatory markers. And so we need to interpret a lab value in relation to the rest of the labs that were drawn. We need to consider your lab value in relation to your signs and symptoms, the medications you took and the timing of those medications. Like, when did you take your last dose of medication prior to the blood draw? How much of your medication did you take? Was it T4? Was it T3? What was the timing? All of that stuff matters on a thyroid panel and your general labs. We also need to take a look at what supplements you were taking and the timing of those. What supplements did you take and when did you take them in relation to the blood draw? And then the last thing I really need to consider is the state. And I've talked about this in a multiple previous podcasts, but we operate in one of 2 states: homeostasis, which is a low stress state. I make all the energy I need to run all the systems of the body under my current load from the food I eat. Homeostasis. The other state is an adaptive, protective state when the body's perceiving an excessive level of stress or danger. And in this state, I'm not making enough energy from the food I eat to run all of the systems of the body optimally under the current load of stressors on my physiology: diet, alcohol, lifestyle, sleep, relationships, all of those things. And so keep in mind that when we're in homeostasis, that's when we should expect lab values to all be in the normal range, maybe in the optimal range. But if we're in allostasis, this stressed or protective uh, regulatory response, we shouldn't expect a thyroid panel to be in an optimal range, maybe not in a normal lab value range. Why? Because the body is saying, hey, there's stress, there's danger. I need to actively decrease the metabolism of the cells and tissues that are involved. And the hormone that's critically important to downregulating the cellular metabolism is your thyroid hormone. So when I see somebody who's got all kinds of signs and symptoms and doesn't feel well, and they tell me that they've been working with an integrative practitioner who's optimized their blood values of their thyroid panel, or they've optimized their sex hormones to what? This is like a fantasy, because if the person's in an allostatic stressed protective state, it's adaptively downregulating the metabolism so it can defend itself and not support the threat. If you provide more thyroid hormone in that situation, you're actually working against the innate intelligence of the body. When the body's in this allostatic stress state, do you think regulating sex hormones are the top of the list? Could putting more hormones into a system that doesn't want it potentially be problematic? Yeah, it could be. So we need to keep in mind that when we look at those labs, we can't just run one test, TSH, two tests, TSH and free T4. We shouldn't really just run a thyroid panel. We should run a comprehensive thyroid panel. If we want to see what the change, like what your medication, you change your medication, now we want to see what the impact is. Sure, you can run a thyroid panel, but it should be a full thyroid panel, not just one marker, because if you just take T4, that could change TSH, it could change T4, but it may cause T3 to go up or down, could cause reverse T3 to go up or down. So we want to see what the impact is. And not only do we want to see what the impact on the thyroid panel is, we want to see the impact on your rest of your physiology. So maybe run a lipid panel, maybe run some liver enzymes, maybe run some glucose markers. So we can see, does the treatment I provided optimize or normalize thyroid panel, but then create problems elsewhere, or not have the intended effect on lipid physiology, on adrenal physiology, on renal physiology, on blood glucose regulation. So we've got to do a little bit more than just manipulate one or two numbers. Anybody can do that, to manipulate a number. But what we're really trying to do is help you feel and function better. And in this situation, this is where I say, if you need thyroid medication, many times you don't, just because the TSH is elevated or T4 or T3 are low. But if you do need some, you want to take the least amount possible so that it doesn't create a bigger problem currently or down the line. Okay. So what takeaways do I have for you today? Well, like, what can you do to help yourself? One, I think everybody should make a list of all their signs and symptoms that they're concerned about. Just make a list, scale them 0 to 10, and then once a week, rescore them. 0 would be, I don't have that symptom in the last week. 10 would be, it's the worst it could possibly be in the last week. And if it's somewhere in between there, give it a number somewhere in between 0 and 10, like 2, 3. And you can track this weekly, you can track it monthly, but you want to track it. And you also want to note when you're changing your medications, changing a supplement, and then what happens to your signs and symptoms in the weeks following a change in medication, a change in supplementation, a change in diet, a change in lifestyle. So you can get an idea of how these things influence your signs and symptoms. You can make a list of your measurables. You can measure your weight, your waist, your hip measurement. You can measure your quads, your biceps, your chest measurements. You can track your pulse rate. You can track your blood pressure, seated and standing. You track your respiratory rate. You can track HRV if you have it. You can track your sleep cycles. If you have a tracking app, track all the measurables and track them weekly or monthly. And so again, when you make a change in your medication or your supplementation or a diet or a lifestyle, you can see how it changes your values. Remember, I said what gets measured gets managed. If you don't measure this stuff, it's hard to remember where you were before and whether what you just did is helping or harming. Okay. I would also suggest that maybe you make a spreadsheet of your labs. And if you're a person who doesn't like to do all this stuff, just make a spreadsheet of your thyroid panel. And when you put your thyroid labs on there, TSH, total T4, total T3, free T4, free T3, T3 uptake, reverse T3, thyroid antibodies, and just make a spreadsheet. And then when you get your labs done, make sure you put on there what the medication was that you took. Was it T4 only? How much? Was it T4 and T3? Was it Armor? Was it NP thyroid? And then the other thing you want to put on there is the dose that you took. So what was the dose? What was the med? What was the dose? And the third thing is, what was the timing? How long after you took your medication did you have your blood drawn? All of this stuff is going to be really important for your clinician, and especially for somebody like me who does want to look at the big picture of what's going on. If you walk in with this stuff, super helpful. So, and then the last thing is write down whatever supplements you took, right? So medication, dose, timing before the blood draw. And then from a supplementation standpoint, what were you taking? If you can get more than a thyroid panel run, I would do that, because then it can give us an indication of not just how we've manipulated the thyroid panel with the lab with medication, but now you also can get an indication of tissue function. And the one I think is sometimes the easiest and least expensive to run along with a thyroid panel is a lipid panel. I think that's everything. So here's what I would say. If you want, you can go to my Instagram, go to Dr. Eric Balkavage on Instagram, and you can DM me checklist, and I will send you my thyroid health symptom checklist to kind of help get you started in tracking. And then while you're there, go to my profile and you can download my ebook, Why You Don't Feel Better on Thyroid Medications. All right. So this is the end of this Thyroid Shorts episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot from it, and look forward to more Thyroid Shorts episodes coming up in the months ahead. While you're on Instagram, if there's a topic that you would like me to cover in this Thyroid Shorts episode, please just send me a message like what you'd like to hear about. And lastly, it would be great if you benefit from the Thyroid Shorts and the Thyroid Answers podcast. Please go and rate us, give us an honest rating on the podcast. All right. Take care. This is Dr. Eric, and I'm signing off. Take care.